young that habitat have. So basically, it's the loss of habitat due to parceling and piecing off, and we'll talk about that as well. So habitat destruction, that's just a complete decimation. So where we take away trees, we're putting up condos. That's something we may need as a community, but it does affect the habitat, or it does affect the wildlife that previously lived there. So habitat degradation is the decreased ability, so the habitat is there, or what the remnants of a habitat are still there, but it's not able to provide for the same number of wildlife as it was before, or its decreased ability to do so. So those are the three main ones that we highlight with NWF. So habitat fragmentation, this is a good depiction of it. So fragmentation happens in general in nature normally, but with increased urbanization, agriculture, it's happening at a rapid rate. So species that were previously able to find mates, find water more readily, are having to travel further and expend more calories and not able to do so, and it creates more competition within a habitat. So fragmentation can look something like this, and that's an agricultural example. So degradation, so pollution is one example of that. How does pollution affect the wildlife that's particularly there? So that critical resource of water is there, but what's the quality of that water? Are wildlife able to actually get to the water and drink it? A monoculture is another example. There's certainly a place to hide or shelter there if you look at the cotton field, but can the diversity of wildlife that previously existed, so if you see in the background there, the trees, is that the same diversity that would exist in the cotton field? Certainly not, right? So it is a decreased ability to provide for the wildlife that previously existed there. And degradation, this is probably the one we're going to harp on the most, and probably the one that you will have the most effect on in your respective careers, is invasive species. So to the left, there's kudzu, which is usually in the southeast, and it covers everything. And so it creates a monoculture. But to the right, this is a picture, the picture of the stream side, is at Mayfield Nature Preserve. So if you look, you'll see maybe a little spot of red here and there. And that's going to be Nandina, or Nandina domestica. And so that water that's trickling down is actually carrying those berries. So next to our preserve, we have a homeowner who might be one of your clients who's deciding to grow Nandina. Does it really harm his yard? No, they look beautiful, right? They're beautiful in their own right. But it creeps over and spreads its roots, and a preserve where it's designated as a place where wildlife is supposed to have that refuge, is now being encroached upon. So that's an example of degradation. And again, habitat destruction, I just like this picture because it looks very, very dramatic. The idea that there's nothing there at all. Yeah, that kind of speaks for itself. Okay, so like I said, we started to increase our focus on pollinators. And so bees are disappearing overall. Everybody's heard of that before? Who doesn't know pollinators are on the decline? Excellent. So pollinators overall on decline, honeybees in particular. Colony collapse disorder is showing up all over the place. And so basically it's where the worker bees are either disappearing altogether, or they have deformities in a viable honey, or excuse me, a viable queen. They have honey, but the overall colony can't produce in the same manner that it could. So can you imagine pollinating by hand? Like, that seems really ridiculous, right? Like, how would we be able to do that? So we can't. It's impossible. So why are pollinators so good at what they do? Well, for one, let's just take the honeybee, for example, is specially adapted with gaucho hair on their legs to be able to pull the pollen as a consequence of what they do already. They naturally go towards nectar, they pull the pollen out, and they pollinate other plants by a means of just doing what they naturally do. So they're integral and just irreplaceable. So let me ask you this, and let's see if you've ever thought about it. What percentage of food do we eat are dependent upon pollinators for production? Test your knowledge. If you feel like yelling it out, it's okay. What do you think? Say, how many? Yeah, at least a third. So how many say percentage-wise? There we go, 10%. Any 10% takers? Seems a little low. Maybe, 60%. All right, we have a 50% coming up as soon as it clicks over. There we go, 50%. Some takers on that? All right, the answer is actually going to be 30%, like you said. Excellent job. So 30% of the food, and that's directly. Now, we're not calculating upward towards the food chain that we are at the top of, right? We're not saying, okay, well, how many of the plants do we eat, or the animals that we eat what's pollinated by other pollinators? That gets into some really complicated math that we're not able right now to fully grasp. All right, so if you're still not convinced, and I'm sure in this crowd you guys are, just how important pollinators are, let's look. Just fruits alone, I'm sure everyone's at least used it in cooking or eaten these recently. These are directly dependent upon pollinators to produce or reproduce. So what about vegetables? Man, cucumber? Wow. That's pretty staggering if you think about the amount of vegetables and fruit we eat that depend directly on pollinators. And I know I'll get you with this last one. If you're like, I don't like watermelon. All right. How about coffee? Yeah, coffee, dill, nutmeg, fennel. All right, so just to end the section on pollinators in general and why they're so important, we'll next highlight things that we can do to save them or to help save them or at least lessen the decline. We're going to talk about the monarch for a little bit. Austin is the central highway of monarch migration. And with the increase in fragmentation, degradation, and just complete destruction, the food source that this particular butterfly depends on is declining. So milkweed naturally occurs in the environment. Antelope milkweed in this area is one in particular. But this particular butterfly depends solely on that to be able to lay its egg and come to the larva form. So not only is it important in its larval stage, as an adult, in order to thrive and ward off predators, it has its whole ecological reputation around being poisonous because of that milkweed. So just keep that in mind, is that monarchs right now are declining at such a rapid rate that we can't even keep up with it. So we'll talk about some things that you can do in the future and in your respective professions to decrease this likelihood that they'll disappear. So when we talk about gardening for wildlife or landscaping for wildlife, let's talk about some myths. These are one that I encounter a lot as a park ranger and as a person that hears very vocally from the public that says, you know what, they attract rats. Technically, no. So when people say rats or mice, they're usually talking about European mice. And a clean landscape with secured refuse and trash usually doesn't attract mice. Mice are naturally occurring is, of course, my response. But usually if you don't have a food source, you're taking away that one element of a habitat for them, and they tend to not congregate in your landscape. This is breeding mosquitoes or pests. So standing water has a tendency to breed mosquitoes. I think an incubation rate of just a couple days. That's true. But what people don't know is that a well-maintained landscape that has circulating water or mosquito fish actually doesn't produce mosquitoes. And if you think about water as a whole, our native grasses soak up more water than say our Bermuda grasses, which don't soak up as many or as much. This is another one that I hear quite a few vocalizations about is they create a fire hazard. So almost anything can catch fire, and that's true. And with us in Bastrop being really on our memory as a collective conscious memory, I can see where this is a concern, and a valid one. But there are ways that you can still provide shelter, food, water, and a place to raise young for wildlife, but maintaining a defensible space. And we'll look at a picture of that as well. Produce airborne pollen. So exotic grasses and ragweed, which we have a lot of here and we can't get away from, actually do produce pollen. Almost all plants produce pollen, but exotic grasses actually produce more pollen. So if you're turning into your native grasses, they'll produce less allergen-producing pollens. And then lower property values. So this is definitely one I want to hit home with you. is that the perception that if you have a naturalistic landscape, that it reduces your property value. This is one we will probably have the most contribution to. Property value is a direct perception of the public, right? Like what we say has value will have value. And in Austin, our city council has already said we value wildlife. That's why this program exists. That's why we're talking to you today. And so if we change the idea that wildlife habitat has a function in our landscapes, then it will become valuable. All right, so let's talk about direct principles that, if you've ever taken a landscape design class, or probably some of you are professors of landscape design yourselves, let's talk about just general concepts in which we can apply principles that are beneficial to wildlife. So the first one's gonna be, we wanna encourage diversity, we wanna use layers, we wanna pay attention to the edges, and we wanna use native plants. And we'll talk about nomenclature with native, exotic, invasive, because there's a lot of discussion around that. All right, so diversity. We want to promote diversity in planting and in planting seasons. So if you have low diversity, that mimics a monoculture, which is not natural. So the more we mimic nature and the way we plant, the more wildlife will be attracted to it. It will decrease a single species competition and allow wildlife to exist at different areas in your landscape. So, layering. So this is really important for all wildlife, but more particularly for birds. So if you think about nesting habits and you think about where birds will get their food from, they do it in different layers of the atmosphere, right? So if you look at flycatchers, crossbill swallows, they'll tend to hover at the top. They'll tend to nest in that area. If you look at thrushes, wrens, and song sparrows, they'll be towards the bottom. So if you're producing different layers in trees and in cover, then you will reduce that competition and encourage more diversity. All right, so we had this picture at the beginning, and this is where I'm going to talk about edges. So in this case, edges are a place where two habitats collide. And two habitats could be a riparian area or a stream area with an inland area. And where that tends to happen in nature, we know more minerals and more opportunity exists for species. So in our edges, for example, if we have a puddling area for butterflies, we also want to create an edge where they would be able to hide, which will also provide cover for another species. So we want to increase our edges and protect those edges, which is different than fragmentation, right? Fragmentation is sort of like the worst type of edge you could have, because where minerals and diversity increased in nature at the edges, we're planting or nothing, like a road. So the edges that we are replacing at a rapid rate, where high minerals used to exist, fragmentation is now replacing that. So if we increase and protect our edges, it'll increase wildlife diversity. And again, we want to mimic nature's edge. And edge will become important when we talk about defensible space, too. All right, so this is a very dense slide on purpose because when there's a lot of discussion behind what is a native plant, what's exotic, what's invasive, what's exotic invasive, and a lot of times they're used interchangeably. So what I would venture to say today is that native plants were the ones that were here prior to European civilization. Adaptive plants are the ones that came after European settling, but they haven't taken over to an extent. They have not become invasive. They're still exotic, but over time, they've become part of our culture, and they have been able to survive in this type of weather and in our changing environment. So they are sort of the cousin of natives, is what you will see. And if you have that landscaping guide that's available online as well, you'll see native and adapted. So we encourage native, but if you have to fill a niche somewhere, adapted would be the next go-to for sure. Invasives spread rapidly, and it's sort of self-explanatory. So can a native plant be invasive? It can have invasive tendencies like ragweed, but we don't consider it an invasive species itself. So it comes from somewhere else, and it comes here and it dominates the landscape, choking out other plants. And so again, exotic is the opposite of native, so it was not here prior to European settlement. And exotic invasive, which is what we have here a lot when we talk about nandina, ligustrum, chinaberry, is that they take over and they've come from somewhere else. So they're very good at adapting at this environment. Sure. Oop.
Your definition for invasive and exotic invasive seems to be the same.
No, and that was thank you for pointing that out. So invasives spread rapidly and they come from somewhere else. Exotic invasive, they're almost interchangeable.
But what like I thought that like what if it's a native invasive plant? You know, like an aspen tree, like there's a big avalanche that changes the conditions, so aspen trees can actually become invasive.
Sure. Yeah, and cedar, Texas cedar or ash juniper is another one that people hear. But when we're talking about wildlife and landscaping principle, we're talking about coming from somewhere else. So like I said earlier, that yes, plants can have invasive tendencies. So it can invade, absolutely. And
I think that's why a lot of people will think that when they hear like the word like the cedar, invasive or fighting cedar, they automatically assume it's not native.
yeah, so that's why I separated them out into two separate ones, right? So because it's exotic doesn't mean it's invasive, and because it's invasive, it does not necessarily mean it's exotic. Does that answer your question? Thank you for that question. Yes.
I worry that the new exotics are the ones that are doing very well here that have come from Australia, from Africa. What's going to happen if we keep using those? That's going to be your next ones on our invasive list.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And that's why we encourage native planting. I think that it's an interesting sort of philosophical question, right? Because if you think about what is an adapted plant, at some point in time, it was an exotic, right? So the important thing, and thank you for bringing this up, is that it's usually the most important thing from this slide is how does it react in the environment? Does it really take out the rest of the native plants? Does it not provide food for wildlife and choke out the water and riparian area like ligustrum does? Or does it just coexist and stay in its own sort of sphere? And over time, a long time, does it become an adapted plant? Does that speak? Yes. I would say it's an invasive exotic, or exotic invasive. Bamboo, actually I was doing a project at the Spyglass entrance of the Greenbelt, and if you stand in a field of bamboo, you will see nothing else. So that's one, too, that's a very aggressive spreader, and it has root plats. You have to get a weed wrench and pull it out, and it's aggressively invasive. Yes?
On that note, I was in England last year. There was a major article about the clumping bamboos going down 40 feet, and owners not able to sell their houses because it had clumping bamboo.
Wow. And that's another point to public perception, right? So that's a place where it seems like exotics have become almost a negative property value, right? You can't even sell your house because of that.
I wonder about the word invasive. If it's a native that spreads rampantly, I would consider calling that aggressive versus invasive because it may belong here, but it may be hard to control. I don't know if that helps clarify between exotic invasive versus maybe aggressive spread that's native. I know like Mexican feathergrass is considered an invasive in California because it takes over areas. And I wonder if it could be a problem here someday because red well lost it, but it's native to Japan. I don't know.
Yeah. So I don't know if everybody heard her. She brought up a good point, is that maybe interchanging invasive with aggressive. And I think that's where the nomenclature gets a little confusing, and I agree with you. An invasive plant is aggressive by nature, and a native plant can be aggressive, but in your mind, it's not necessarily invasive. Is that, am I, okay, great. Yes? Excellent point. So she said, bringing back one of our principles that we talked about earlier, which was diversity. So one of the things about aggressive and invasive plants, if we want to separate those two out, then they both decrease diversity. And so they inhibit other plants from growing there and thus inhibit diversity in wildlife. Yeah.
I would kind of disagree with that. It's like what came first, the chicken or the egg? It seems to me it's more the land or the soil was disturbed to such a way maybe certain minerals and nutrients were removed, and only maybe a certain one or two species that are native grow in those areas because nothing else can, they become aggressive or invasive.
Sure, ragweed is an example of that. It's a bluebonnets, or most of our wildflowers, they are nitrogen fixers, so they tend to congregate on our highways. And so, but the difference is that they'll go away if other plants, so they're pioneer plants, so to speak. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. All right, I'm going to keep moving. 15 more? Okay. All right, let's see. Okay, excellent. I love that discussion because this is a discussion I have a lot with my colleagues and people in the field, so thank you for the feedback. All right. Okay, so I'm going to sum it all up into how you can help, and you may already be doing this. If you are, thank you. So using native and adaptive plants, we talked about that. Choosing plants with diverse colors. This is going to be particularly important for our pollinators. Choosing plants with diverse colors, shapes, and sizes. So it goes to the third one. So bees will be attracted to a different type of plant than a butterfly that has to light on a plant. So something more broad would attract a butterfly with a short source to nectar. Whereas something like a hummingbird would like long tubular-shaped flowers where it can stick its beak and its tongue in there and get the nectar. So planting that will attract at least 2 or 3 different types of pollinators as opposed to just one broadleaf type of plant. And then select plants with varying heights, growth, and habitats and flowering times. So this is going to be extremely important in our winter times. If you're layering, we already talked about that, that's going to be the varying height and growth. And flowering times, the most critical time that wildlife is at need of food and water is going to be around the winter time when we are in a drought. So planting trees like the possum haw who will flower in colder weather and making sure that you have a constant source of water is one of the ways to combat that.
I just want to point out that color helps out a lot too. If you plant flowers that are white, it'll encourage nocturnal pollination.
Thank you. Good job, thank you. So, and then include plants for butterfly larvae as well as nectar and pollen-producing flowers. So we talked about that particularly with the monarch. Yes?
You know, it's like a lot of these big box stores and stuff are selling plants, and they're putting them on tables saying that for pollinators, so they're all being sprayed with a systemic insecticide, which means that, you know, I don't know how that affects the actual pollinators, but anything that's feeding on them, like if you get a milkweed, you put it in your yard, you get a monarch, it's going to die.
Yeah.
I mean, can y'all address it at all through the city?
So, yes and no. So we are in discussion with big business, or with big business, with businesses, box businesses, or your common stores, to encourage that, right? Meredith and I are a team of 2 right now with much support from the city. But really, it's our habitat stewards and you guys that can really help us say, this is not an acceptable product. We want to see more. And remember I said that public perception? Well, ultimately, those businesses are in business. And so if we continue to buy them and we continue to encourage people around us to buy them, then they'll continue to be sold. And another aspect of your point is that the colony collapse disorder, we haven't been able to fragment out exactly what is contributing to that with honeybees, but part of that is the pesticides and herbicides that we're using. Did you have another point or a question?
What if, like, at the big box stores, the company is required to, like, have a sign above it and say, all these have been sprayed with systemic insecticide?
Yeah.
I'm glad that they are actually, and I think it's A&M maybe is starting a pilot program where they're going to do the flip side of that and have labels that this is safe for,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah, and I think that's actually more effective because then you give the consumer a choice, and ultimately the one that's not chosen will phase out. Or not chosen. The one that's not chosen will phase out. Yes?
A lot of these nurseries don't, the retail nurseries may treat their plants very little, and most of the treatment those plants underwent were done at the production nursery. Like these plants are bought from huge nurseries like Heinz Nursery or others outside of the state and trucked in. And there are a lot of regulations as far as spreading pests, and these plants have to be sprayed whenever they're shipped to ensure that they're not transporting very little, if
No,
anything.
but you're right, but the thing is, these systemic insecticides, they'll stay in the plant for like 4 to 5 months.
Right, but targeting the retailer, you know, I'm not sure it's gonna do much. I mean, it could, you know, retailers may start working with producers, you know, to try to cut back on that. But, you know, I just want to point that out.
Well, thank you for your comment. And I think going back to your point about just providing more options at stores that most people frequent might be the way to go in that regard. That's right. All right. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, and the other thing I'd like to say is we'd like to tap your expertise. Like I said, we're co-hosting with Urban Forest Stewards a habitat steward, urban forest steward sort of training. And really that group is the group that we rely on to change public perception and to help us in ways that we are limited as a government entity. But I think you're absolutely right in that regard. So I'm just going to reiterate the certification process. So if you are not certified and you have these items, then we can get you a prepaid application. Or if you have clients that you know of, or schools, or businesses that are practicing and that have these in their landscape designs, please contact us, and I'll have my contact information at the end, and so will Meredith Gray. So providing food, so seeds, nectar, fruit, bio-native plants, water, and we're really stressing the consistent water source. That's probably the one that most people have the most difficulty with, because especially on small scales, a bird bath will dry up like that, and if you're busy, you won't notice it, but the wildlife will. And so being able to provide a consistent water source is one that we like feedback on, and we're encouraging. Shelter, so thickets, rock piles, not mortaring the joints of rock walls if you're building them, so that that's a place to hide. And a place to raise young, including host plants, nesting boxes, larger trees, and the sustainable gardening practices of using or being organic when you're planting, choosing organic plants, mulching, and composting. So incorporating food, this is probably the one that most people are already doing in their yards. Incorporating water, again, this is where we have to get a little bit more creative. Even a small dish of water in the heat of summer is like an oasis for wildlife. And then incorporating cover, so brambles, rock piles, bushes qualify for that. And then a place to raise young, again, and going back to the antelope milkweed rather than tropical. And then again, we're going to encourage sustainable garden practices such as composting, mulching out to the drip line, making sure that it's not touching the edge of the bark, making sure you have that finger space, and just being conscious of how we use our water. Yes. So, yes, we are discouraging it, but we can only do so much. Really, your neighbor saying, this is unacceptable, let me help you, let me teach you how, is more effective than me coming up and telling you that you are not providing food and shelter for wildlife. Our best method that we have found is educating people of how easy it is to provide this stuff in your yard. And it's something that we've been aware of, that a lot of people say they're being water wise, and so rocks, don't require much water, and really it's a way to escape addressing one of the bigger issues. So I have friends and colleagues who have argued that, and it is a contentious topic that we are talking about and will come up in habitat steward training, and that we are discouraging by educating and engaging people to do otherwise, which is provide food, shelter, and water for wildlife.
My understanding is that on commercial properties, the stone mulch or the rock or glass is discouraged or even not allowed by the environmental conservancy, like we want.
I'm sorry.
On residential properties, it's different, but I believe on commercial properties, that the stone mulch is not allowed.
Yeah, we don't encourage that, and really it's not really to our benefit because we can reuse some of our biological refuge or waste as mulch, right? So we don't really have an invested interest in being able to do that. All right, awesome. I'm gonna move on. Okay, and like I said, if you or your clients or the people that you work with are interested in getting their backyard certified or their workplace or businesses or schools, then you can email wildlife@austintexas.gov. We'll send a prepaid application if you're located in the city of Austin. We have purchased this from the National Wildlife Federation in order to facilitate this process. And it's a great little incentive, and it's very easy to qualify as long as you have those things. And if you need advice, LaJuan, I don't really know if we qualify. If you call us up or email us, we'll be happy to help you, or send us a habitat steward out to help you. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of plants and talk about their benefit. So flameleaf sumac is one of my favorite. A lot of people like Nandina because it changes to a beautiful fall color, and I'm from Philadelphia originally and went to school in New Hampshire, so I miss the fall. And this one has a showy fall color. It also is a host plant, so if you're thinking about providing food with the berries, and as well as a place to raise young, you've hit 2 of them already. And so it provides for the hair streak. Go ahead.
I've also noticed, though, is that it seems to be one of the few plants that blooms really in the summer, because you're talking about overlapping, like, nectar sources.
Yep.
I've seen honeybees just
Flock to it, yeah. All right. American beautyberry. This is another one that really the berry producing plants are extremely helpful when wildlife need food. So it's a good shade plant. A lot of people say we have to have full sun to be able to provide for wildlife. It's just simply not true. Turk's cap is another one that provides excellent food sources for wildlife. And this is another one that will grow in shade, and it's very, very beautiful.
Is that coralberry also?
No, so that's coralberry. And this is beautyberry. So it's a bit more magenta in color. If you've ever walked in Turkey Creek, Emma Long area, it grows kind of down by Turkey Creek. It's very beautiful. All right, I'm gonna speed ahead a little bit. Fall aster is another one. It blooms a lot. This is one of those plant types that have the flowering type that's attractive to butterflies. So it has that wide base and short nectar source where they can use their proboscis to get to the nectar. So if you plant this in your yard, it will bloom a lot, so you want to cut it back in order to contain it. Let's skip ahead to our grasses. So remember, one of the myths that we said is perpetuated is that grasses have allergen effects and they are encourage mosquitoes. This is one of our grasses that we'll see a lot in native landscapes. It provides a nesting material for ground nesting birds. The seed heads provide food, and it's really just beautiful and very Texas looking and very wild, so I love this one. And then sunflowers, that's another one I'm gonna highlight, is sunflowers themselves the seed heads are very nutritious for seed-eating birds. All right, so we do have a landscape design example on city land at 200 South Lamar. We have a wildlife habitat there, and it looks like this, and it actually integrates different sections of wildlife. So there's a bird habitat that has inland seed oats. There is shade-tolerant plants and a water source to the right. So if you want to go and walk through one right now, it's a little died back, but you can still see examples of food, shelter, water, and a place to raise young. Okay, so the last slide, I believe, is going to be about firewise gardening. So you can still provide for wildlife without overgrowing your yard. So just making sure that around your actual house, you're maintaining a defensible space where fire cannot jump, or that you're not having trees that overlap onto your gutter system that could spark into your gutter. Really, that's what it's about, is maintaining a space around and segregating parts of your plant community so that fire doesn't have a way of spreading upwards, like lateral fuels, or outwards. So again, this is something that we're developing more of to give examples and templates of how to maintain a defensible space, even in a wildlife garden. Okay, so this is my shameless plug of our habitat steward training that we are now partnering with urban forest stewards with. If you want to learn more, if you want to have more discussions about a native versus adapted, big box stores, and the answer to providing more sustainable practices and more options for consumers, this is the place to do it. These are the brain heads that are together talking about what it takes to provide wildlife, and really what it takes to change that public perception for us in Austin to adopt this on a large scale. Okay, any questions that we haven't had or talked during the break or during the discussion? All right. Oh. Antelope milkweed?
I have some pictures there. I purchased a seed kit last year from Native American Seeds out of the Lady Bird Johnson Waffles. It's a milkweed kit. It comes with the seeds for 3 different milkweeds. Antelope one is one of them. I grew that kit, had awesome results with it. I would encourage anybody who's interested in milkweeds to try it out. They don't sell them because apparently they don't transplant well. So it was an awesome kit. It was a great way to get some milkweeds out of my garden.
Native American seed? Thank you. Cool, thank you. NIPSOD.
Monarch Watch, the organization, and then the last one would be the Butterfly Forum, which meets at Zilker Botanical Garden monthly. Yeah. Thank you so much, LaJuan. We really appreciate your help today.